if you imagine the way space is dispersed in the solar system, you have most of the concentration of gravity at the center of the sun, and the centers of the planets and moons, and then on their surfaces where the atmosphere meets the planet, there's usually a concentration of high level patterning just on the edge of the atmosphere where it meets what we call space. But the thing about space is that it's actually everywhere, even in stuff. There's space between the electrons and everything. And that's literally the same space when you think about what space is. And so it penetrates all areas of the physical world, possibly except for black holes. But my question is, if the center of the universe expanded for 14 billion years before our planet even got here, or whatever, 10 billion years, who's to say that the laws of physics on this side of that expansion are the same as the laws of physics on the other side? For example, when a balloon explodes, the shrapnel goes equally outward in all directions. And we know that the laws of physics weren't even formed, or at least obeyed, in the early ages of inflation, if we're taking the Standard Model into consideration. And so space could be a product of mass, but space could also be an infinitely expanding void that is sort of like a housing for energy, a structure. You know what I mean? Because space is influenced by gravity and things with mass, is what I meant to say. Space is influenced by mass and gravity, and light travels through space if space is fundamental, as in exists regardless of where you are in reality, then when we say space-time is expanding, what we potentially mean is the potential for unfoldment increases more than the unfoldment. So, like, you're pouring a cup of water, but the more you pour, the bigger the cup gets. Is space a giant box that the universe is housed in? Or is it something less fundamental, like a result of mass? It's a good question. You got to look at the concentration of patterning and find where the edges of things are, like the surface of a planet versus the atmosphere. The contrast of the amount of space creates a habitable zone for things to move and stand upright and look outward at the containing solar system. Because remember, it's all about the point of reference. And we're talking about concentration of mass, which is really the concentration of energy, and the concentration of space. There's far less space at the center of the sun than there is in the sky, right? So you got to think of things as terms of matter and space, creating this structure that is like energy pulsing through it always. That's what reality actually is. All the energy that exists all the time. It's just transforming constantly. And so the molecules and stuff are like the housing, and they're arranged in such a way that the energy stays in one spot as far as the atomic level is concerned. But the nature of energy in the physical world is movement and vibration and change. So the space that this is happening in is everywhere except for where the energy is. They're really just two pieces to the puzzle. It's like Swiss cheese and the holes in the Swiss cheese, you know? You can't have a hole without the space where there's no thing that it's in. So, now what? Because there's a duality between space and energy. And the waves, you know, have constructive interference and destructive interference. Sometimes they help each other and sometimes they bump into each other. You know what I'm saying? And so matter exists regardless of the fact that antimatter exists. And the speed of light is the foundation of the entire structure, because if light could go at any speed, it wouldn't obey the same physics, and this cascades outward into the way that gravity behaves and into the way that the strong and weak nuclear forces behave. Really, I imagine it just like a grid, and the grid is, you know, fluctuating, but there's always space between the lines. And so depending on how the grid is fluctuating, on or not on, you know what I'm saying? And this gives rise to information. if there's enough interference between the parts of the grid, they sort of create information which auto collects and organizes into stuff like quarks. That's my theory. It's basically a string theory, but instead of the existence of strings, it's more like the behavior of this grid. And so when the grid sort of like, imagine a sphere and turns into a sphere, when it folds, there's going to be areas where it crosses itself. You know what I mean? In order to get the round surface of a sphere with a flat grid. No matter how you do it, there's going to be areas that are concentrations of those interactions. And a basic level of one crossing one gives rise to, let's say, color. Two colors interacting, so a baseline of, 1, 1, and then a separate, -1, -1, or whatever, will give you two colors. Now, these colors can self-assemble because they function on a different set of physics. They function on a level that says, oh, well, color influences space. So the red one pushes away the yellow one, for example, and that, sends the information back down to the grid, and the grid responds to this new parameter being introduced by having hyperdimensional experiences. Things that co-align, the real juicy colors. So grid theory can explain the physical world, and, I think it can explain the metaphysical world. Because there's like I guess the technical term would be non-dualism, as in there's no separation between life and death. There is only transformation of energy, and therefore there's membranes and parts of the universe that can't interact based on its structure, like the difference between being dead and being alive.